Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar entitled Complex Trauma in the Classroom: Considerations for Building Relationships with Students Impacted by Complex Trauma. All participants are muted throughout the webinar. Please submit any questions using the Questions tab. Questions will be answered within the last 15 minutes of the presentation. And now we will have an introduction of our speaker by Dr. Jacqueline Brown.
Thank you. Dr. Laura McArthur studied and trained at the University of Colorado, University of Utah, and University of San Francisco. Her areas of focus include trauma, systems change, child and family development, multicultural psychology, and social justice. Dr. McArthur has led the growth of the UCSF Healthy Environments in Response to Trauma in Schools, the HEARTS program in Colorado, in addition to directing a school-based mental health team. Dr. McArthur has led over 100 trainings and workshops and has provided training and supervision for over 15 new HEART staff as the program expanded. Dr. McArthur's work is focused on ensuring all students, teachers, parents, and schools are supported in connecting their own resilience through evidence-based training, consultation, and mental health services. I would like to thank Dr. McArthur for taking the time to share her knowledge and experience surrounding trauma-informed schools. Thank you also to all of you in attendance for taking the time out of your schedules to be here today. The recorded webinar will be distributed by Division 16. I will now pass it over to Dr. McArthur.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be with you today. I'm excited to tell you about some of the work that I've been doing with complex trauma in the classroom. And I want to first acknowledge that a lot of my work is developed out of their original UCSF HEARTS program and has been adapted from presentations at that program and at the Aurora Mental Health Center HEARTS program that operates in Colorado. I am now the co-founder and executive director of a new nonprofit called Resilient Futures, where we will continue to offer the HEARTS program as well as other trauma-informed trainings and consultation. So this is me, and this is my email, and a little bit of what Jackie already kind of covered about me, but my interests, really are on building resilience in schools and communities that have been impacted by trauma. So taking kind of more of a public health approach and really looking at system-wide and school-wide change. So I want to just start by going over some of the learning objectives. I'm sure there's a wide variety of folks on the webinar today, and so I'm going to cover a few different areas. First, I want us all to understand the impact of complex trauma on student behavior and learning in schools. Also want to help you develop some skills to build safe and secure relationships with students who have been impacted by complex trauma. And then explore some strategies to support students in building resilience through relationships. And I want to acknowledge that I really want all of you to have this information and these skills, but also knowing a lot of the roles you're in, maybe also helping other adults develop these skills and bringing these kinds of strategies to teachers or other staff in the school as much as you can. So some of the references, you'll see a lot more actually woven in throughout, but these are some of the primary references that I'll be working from today. So some foundational work around complex trauma from the NCTSN, as well as some other research that has focused on child trauma, mental health, and just considerations in how we treat and approach complex trauma. So I want to just start by telling a little bit of a story. It's kind of a combination of stories that really, encompasses different kinds of things that we see kids and teachers in schools experience on a regular basis. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the story first, and then I'll tell you a little bit more in a little bit. So I'm talking about a kid that we'll call Michael. He's a 5th grader, and he attends an elementary school in his neighborhood. One day he shows up to school quite late and without his homework, and his teacher is pretty immediately kind of frustrated and annoyed with him for not having his homework, tells him to go sit down and start reading. Michael goes over to his desk, another kid's sitting at his desk, so he tells him to leave. The kid won't. They kind of get into a little bit of an altercation. The teacher starts yelling at them. Michael gets escalated and ends up flipping over the desk and all of the contents in it, and just kind of storming out of the classroom. The teacher calls the sort of behavioral specialist, and he comes in, grabs Michael, who is, sort of, swearing at him and, not having a very good time. So what the behavioral specialist ends up doing is calling, Michael's uncle, who's currently taking care of him, and suspending Michael for the altercation with the student, for flipping over the desk, and for, the swear words and things like that. So we hear stories like this in my work, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with stories like this as well, a lot of the time. And what we often end up asking is, what's wrong with Michael, and what's wrong with his teacher? And so one of the things that we help teachers understand it is that's a normal place to go to. The teacher's thinking, God, what's wrong with this kid? He comes to school late all the time. He never has his homework done. Never sort of is able to, just follow the rules and do what he's supposed to do. And a lot of times, administrators or other people in the school are thinking, what's wrong with this teacher? Like, why can't this teacher just be supportive and understand, what's going on with Michael, and try and help him and be more patient. So with a trauma-informed approach, what we're really trying to do is, here it goes, is go to a new perspective, to shift our perspective from the one that asks what's wrong with you to one that asks what's happened to you. And this is, pretty familiar language in the trauma-informed world, so you may have heard this before. But what's so important about this shift is that it really fosters compassion, and it provides context. And so rather than thinking, what's wrong with Michael? Why can't he function in this school? Or what's wrong with this teacher? Why can't, he or she just kind of be nice? The question really shifts our thinking to what's happened to Michael, what's happened to his teacher. So now I'll tell you a little bit more about the story. So on this particular day, Michael was late to school because, he was up all night. His uncle and his uncle's girlfriend had been fighting. They've been in kind of a physical altercation. His mom has been in and out of the house, but he never kind of knows if she's going to show up or not. She did show up, but she was intoxicated, and so his uncle made her leave. Michael, woke up late, didn't have his homework, and didn't have a ride to school. His neighborhood's not a neighborhood that we would want him necessarily walking through alone. So he kind of went over to a couple of neighbors' houses and finally found a ride to school because his uncle and girlfriend weren't able to bring him. So he gets to school, immediately, gets kind of in trouble for not having his homework and not being there in time. And so that kind of sets him off further. But what we also need to know is what's happening to this teacher. So Michael's teacher is a teacher in one of our, what we call in Colorado anyways, our turnaround schools. And so this teacher is under intense pressure to have test scores go up, to have students' academic achievement improve, and to really foster learning as much as possible. So this teacher's kind of going through all of this pressure, and the teacher knows that his job is on the line. He's, he's pretty aware that he may or may not have a job next year, and a lot of that will be determined by the scores of his students. So when Michael then sits down or goes to sit down and someone's in his desk, that's a trigger for him. For a lot of kids with complex trauma, having their own space, having a consistency and predictability is incredibly important, and not having that is a really big trigger. And so he responds with kind of aggression and trying to get into this altercation. And the teacher is also escalated at this point because, again, of all of the pressures they're under. This is also a school that is experiencing a lot of community violence, and so there are often lockdowns. There are often times where it may or may not be safe for kids to sort of be out in the community. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking. There must be a squirrel outside or something. So when we make the shift to what's happened to Micah, what's happened to the teacher, and what's happened to the school, it really sets us up for understanding complex trauma in a different way. The way that I often approach it with schools is to take some work from the ARC model from Blaustein and Kinniburgh and some other work around complex trauma that really helps us understand what are some ways that we can build resilience through relationships. So these are kind of three different pieces that I'm going to address. Primarily, I'll address the attachment piece today since we're talking about relationships, but the other pieces are also really important to think about. So the ARC model, if you're not familiar with it, talks about attachment, self-regulation, and competency as kind of the three main areas to focus on when you're working with kids with complex trauma. And what we've done in the HEARTS program is build that in and work with all of that information as it applies to working in schools. So first, a little bit about complex trauma. As the NCTSN defines it, it's the experience of multiple traumatic events, often that occur within the caregiving system, the social environment that is supposed to be the source of safety and stability in a child's life. So when we start talking with schools about trauma, they're often, teachers are identifying, things that they know kids have experienced, like abuse, neglect, parental incarceration, mental illness, substance abuse, those kinds of things. And what we also help them uncover just, all the other ways that trauma can show up and the sort of added or, different kind of impact that trauma has when it is within the caregiving system, whether that's the family or the school, or I think even the community. We would hope to expect that schools and communities would also be providing a lot of support for children, and often they are the source of the trauma. So I'm just going to also give you a brief overview of attachment so you kind of know where I'm coming from. We know attachment is the close personal bond between the infant and the caregiver that endures over time, and that it forms our foundations for relationships. It shapes our expectations of what to expect of ourselves and how to perceive the world. And one of the ways that I explain this to teachers is I'll ask them to think, if I have a group of teachers in the room, I'll ask them to think about going to a new restaurant. So we've all been to restaurants, and when we go to a new restaurant, even though we've never been there before, we pretty much know what to expect. We know that when we go in, there will be a host or a hostess that will be seated, that will be given menus, that we will order food, that will eat our meal, pay the check. That there's some of these basic expectations that if they don't happen are kind of odd, but we use that template of restaurants to kind of know what to expect when we go to a new one. And it's the same for attachment in relationships. We use our templates of relationships from our earliest relationships to kind of set our expectations of what to expect in other relationships down the road. We know that attachment is closely involved in modulating the stress response system and emotional regulatory system, and that this is through the co-regulation that I will talk about. And attachment fosters all of these kinds of things that are really important for school success: exploration and mastery, feelings of self-confidence, empathy, language development, reasoning, and the ability to manage and resolve conflict. So when attachment is impaired through complex trauma, because again, the trauma is happening in the attachment relationship, then we see some struggles. So I mentioned co-regulation, and this is what these pictures are really demonstrating, is just how we as adults provide co-regulation for our littlest ones. We help them learn how to identify emotions. We help them learn how to express emotions. We help them modulate by soothing, supporting, providing space and empathy and love to go through and learn how to do that kind of regulation. When this doesn't happen, or when this is impacted or impaired by a complex trauma, we see some difficulties as children develop. So if the child's caregiver is the source of trauma or is unable to provide the co-regulation, the child's development of emotional regulation skills can be derailed. And this really is a hallmark symptom of complex trauma. The way that sometimes teachers will talk about this is they'll say, I'll be working with this kid one day and we'll have a really good day, and he'll do really good work together with me, and then the next day he doesn't want anything to do with me. And so sometimes these really confusing behaviors and relationships are some of the things that show up first in kids who've been impacted by complex trauma. And this can affect relationships all the way into adulthood, of course, which we know about attachment. So we want to be able to provide kids with some different experiences earlier on, so that this isn't going to see them all the way through adulthood in this way. And as much as all of this trauma and impairment can happen in the relationship, relationships are also where the healing takes place. And you'll hear me say that a few more times, that yes, that's often where some of the harm has been done, but it's also where a lot of the healing can happen as well. So here are some of the things that we see show up, especially in our schools, when kids are having attachment difficulties related to complex trauma. They feel really uncertain about the reliability and predictability of the world. They have interpersonal struggles, problems with boundaries. So you have the kids who, have never met you before, but immediately want to come over and give you a hug or sit on your lap or things like that. Or the other side of really, really disengaged, really no connection. Kids who are really distrustful and suspicious, who socially isolate, who have difficulty attuning to people's emotional states. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about a kid who hasn't gotten much in the way of co-regulation isn't going to know how to do that for someone else, right? They're not going to know how to help someone else kind of figure out what they're feeling if they don't really have a good grasp on that for themselves either. And difficulty enlisting other people as allies. And this is a really important one that we see. I just saw this play out in a classroom yesterday, where there's a couple of kids who have, these significant trauma histories, but one of them really is able to connect with adults, and adults are really willing to help this kid out. And the other one really isn't. He's really disengaged. His affect's really flat. He really doesn't want to give any sort of reinforcement to any adult trying to support him. And that ends up kind of pushing people away. So a little bit more about how this plays out. As far as relationships with school personnel, we see kids who are really preoccupied with safety, who are really distrustful. And one of the things we see the most is that kids might only feel safe when they're in control. And so anytime there's a loss of control or a perceived loss of control, that can often be a really big trigger for a kid with a complex trauma history. We also see, difficulties in relationships with peers. Sometimes kids who have experienced complex trauma have difficulty seeing people as people. They see them as kind of sources of terror or pleasure, or sort of objects, but have difficulty seeing them as other humans with their own needs and desires. And then what we also see is that working with trauma can pull for intense emotions in staff. So we see vicarious and secondary trauma show up in teachers and counselors, school psychologists, administrators, pretty much anyone at the school who might be impacted by the trauma that kids are potentially bringing in with them. So back to what I said a minute ago, relationships really are the central piece to how we can heal some of these struggles. So how do we get kids to learn how to trust adults, to learn how to express, and identify how they're feeling, to develop peer relationships that are healthy and attuned? And what we know is that when we experience compassionate and dependable relationships, we reestablish the trust, the connections, and we create opportunities for new corrective emotional experiences. Every positive attuned interaction with a trustworthy other can help rewire the brain. And I'm not going to go into the brain science about this today. There's certainly a lot out there about how this happens and how the brain can change over time with more positive and attuned relationships. So humans are hardwired for connection. We need it. It's how how we operate. And healthier relationships really involve attunement and the ability to reflect back experience. And these are two pieces that are completely missing when you're not getting the co-regulation that we hope you would get really early on in those attachment relationships. So this is being sensitive and responsive to the feelings and needs of ourselves and others. And attuned relationships help us feel safe and calm us down when stressed. Whenever teachers are struggling with like, kind of what do I do first, or a parent's having a hard time with just their communication with their child, we always kind of start with attunement. And we also know that strong relationships are a cornerstone to school success. So one of the strongest predictors of academic success is students' perception of, does the teacher like me? They've shown up to 20% test score improvements or differences between kids who really believe that their teacher likes them and kids who don't. Another quote on this slide, the most powerful protective factor in schools was the caring, supportive relationships that students had with all types of educators. And this is important too, because as much as we want every child to have that one person behind them, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, we also don't want every teacher to feel like they now have to be, or every school psychologist or every coach, that they now have to be that one person for every kid they come into contact with. It really is a community-wide effort that we need. So Bronfenbrenner has this quote that I just love that says, every child needs one person who is crazy about them. And the resilience research has really backed that up, and the research around attachment and complex trauma has backed that up. So we start with attunement. Consistent, responsive, nurturing relationships is key. And how to do that is to first have some understanding of how to reframe the meaning of the behavior, which is kind of what we talked about. Instead of thinking of what's wrong with you, thinking about what happened to you. And then go into some of these basic steps of attunement and empathy. Mirror, validate, empathize. This is kind of my refrain for teachers when we're getting started on trying to build in some trauma-informed strategies in the classroom to really support kids with complex trauma. So mirroring doesn't just mean, so there are ways to do this verbally. Let me see if I got that, or what I hear you saying is, but there's more to mirroring than just the words. Mirroring really is supposed to take us to that sort of really basic good listening level. It really slows us down, and it helps focus the communication. And when I think about mirroring, I think about listening with your whole body. So not just listening to the words, but also looking at what's the body language telling you? Is the child, sitting next to you, kind of pulling away from you? Are they talking with, rushed speech or really quietly? Are they saying they're angry, but they're crying and they actually look really sad? Trying to really get on their level of what you're seeing from their whole body communication, not just what they're saying. When a kid is in a sort of triggered state, and again, I'm not going to go into the brain piece of this, but what we do know is that their language skills are essentially kind of offline, and that we often will get more information from just really understanding their body language and their other cues, rather than just kind of what they're saying. The next kind of piece we want to get to is validation, and so just understanding and not necessarily agreeing. And I have done groups with parents a lot where they really push back on this and say, well, I don't want to validate the fact that my kid wants to stay out until 3 a.m. And I'm saying you don't have to agree with it and you don't have to let them, but validation is just understanding. Can you just understand why your teenager would want to stay out late? And if it's not making sense to you, you may just not have enough information yet. If you can't kind of figure out why someone is upset or why they're having a difficult moment, you may just need more information. And then empathy takes it a step further, right? I can imagine that this might make you feel really upset. And is there anything else that you're feeling? And just kind of diving in more to that emotional piece. So let me talk a little bit more about reframing the meaning of the behavior too, because that really helps with the mirror, validate, empathize steps. Remember that internal working model. So remember that kids are set up from the very beginning with this working model of relationships, and it's guiding their interactions with you and everyone else. So this is a really important when we're helping teachers not take behavior personally, because it really is about the working model of a child and how they're going to play out their relationship expectations. So they are often expecting us to act in a certain way, and they'll often behave in such a way as to almost guarantee that whatever responses are going to happen are going to fit with their working model. So these kids who can really push buttons, right? They can really kind of just know the right or the wrong thing to say and the way to get reactions that most teachers really don't want to give. I just talked to a teacher the other day who said, I just kind of lost my cool and then I said something, and reflecting back on it, we've identified that this kid elicits that response from a lot of teachers, and not intentionally, but just because that potentially is how their expectations of relationships go, and that's what they're most comfortable with. So creating a corrective emotional experience is one of my favorite things to talk with teachers about. This is really where we get at how important it is to just provide a new and a more satisfying response to children's typical relationship patterns. So the kid who's typically yelled at, or who's typically treated like the bad kid, or the kid that just doesn't get it or doesn't do the right thing, we can think about how we can respond differently to that child to kind of help them start to make some changes to that internal working model. And one way to do that is to kind of reflect with yourself, or if you have some partners that you can do this with. Am I helping to create a new and reparative relationship with this child? Or am I being drawn into an interaction that is familiar for him or her, but problematic overall? So this kid that I was talking about earlier, who's really disengaged, it's just going to take so much work on the part of the adults to not play into that, because his working model is that people don't care about me. I'm sure that that's what it is, and that that he's not worth caring about. And so every teacher and adult in this kid's life is going to have to work really hard to keep giving him experiences that he is cared about, that he does matter, and that he is worth caring about. Another relationship building tool is to really think about, affirmations versus criticism, and thinking about them kind of as deposits and withdrawals. A lot of times our kids who have experienced the most trauma are our most challenging kids as far as their behavior and difficulties in the classroom. And so this can be challenging to think about sometimes, of how to really make more deposits, more affirmations than withdrawals, and the criticisms. So what this does is it focuses when we focus our praise on positive actions, we support a sense of competence and autonomy that does help students develop self-esteem. And I do think it also helps prevent some of the things we see happen when kids who are constantly being corrected, whether it's because of a trauma-related behavior, whether it's because they have, attention deficit disorder and their difficulty staying in their seat, we see kids start to take, years and years of that teacher feedback and internalize it, and really start to develop some anxiety and even depression around just how they see themselves as students. And so it's really important to sort of build some awareness here and build some strategies about how to increase the deposits, ideally to, even maybe a 5-to-1 ratio. So that's something that I really enjoy working with teachers on as well, and other school staff, to sort of flesh that out. Really important part of all of this is back to that impact on the school staff and the school psychologists and teachers and the folks who are really interacting a lot with students who've been impacted by trauma. It's really important to stay present in the moment, and I know this can be really difficult. So there's I have some ideas about that, but just remembering that you can come back to this later. You can sort of reflect, converse about this later, but really try to stay present with that student in the moment. Monitor and identify your own emotions. We really have to practice our own self-regulation skills to have some of these difficult conversations with kids. I know some staff who've created some affirmations to themselves around, really when they're really trying not to take the student behavior personally, really identifying like, this isn't my trauma, or, this isn't about me. I'm here to support this kid. Just some things that you can think of to yourself that can help you stay focused. Practicing some active mindfulness can really help. And so just whatever that is for you, whether that's focus on your breath or focus on sort of some grounding in the room, kind of noticing where your body is, what you're hearing, what you're seeing, anything that can help you still stay in that present and oriented space. And then I think, make sure that you have, some time to, however you do it, to process some of these interactions later, whether that's through talking with a coworker or supervisor, writing about it, exercising, getting something going where you're moving through some of those difficulties. And I do have, this is sort of just an hour, so there's so much more to talk about here, but just, really dig into some of the work around compassion fatigue and burnout and secondary trauma too, if you're interested in that more. So I'm going to move into talking a little bit about the self-regulation skills that we can hopefully help kids with complex trauma build out as well through our relationships with them. Van der Kolk talks about how at the core of traumatic stress is the breakdown in the capacity to regulate internal states. And we see this time and time again with kids. So we see difficulty in the capacity to identify, express, and modulate emotions when kids have been impacted by complex trauma, when they've missed out on that co-regulation. And so these are some considerations for us as the adults in their life of how do we build out these areas? How do we support them in learning how to identify, express, and modulate? So what does that mean? So deficits in capacity to identify internal emotional experiences. Sometimes this shows up as just trouble differentiating states of arousal. So kids will just, kind of think if they're high energy, they're happy. If they're low energy, they're sad, and not really understand kind of some of the differences or differentiation among different states. Difficulties with the safe expression of emotion can look either overly constricted or rigid, or excessively labile and explosive. And it can kind of go back and forth between those things too. You might have a kid where you never know if they're going to explode or not. And some days they're just very tightly controlled. And other days they can't control their behavior, or their affect at all. And then an impaired capacity to modulate emotional experience. So how to self-regulate, how to self-soothe is often impaired for kids who've had early complex trauma. So some strategies around this. One is, let's start with that energy versus feelings piece and really help kids learn the difference there, versus between energy and feelings, and start to identify at what energy level is the child most comfortable. There were some kids, I was in a classroom yesterday that were really excited for the fun run today, and other kids that weren't. And we talked about how some of those kids probably need a fun run, which is their 20-minute run every day, and they might need it a couple times a day, and that's really different from some other kids. But every kid needs some time during the day to be at their most comfortable energy level. And then what energy level is most effective given specific situations? So we often are asking kids to sit at their desk and do work, but do kids have the tools and strategies that they need to actually be able to do that, to be able to sit at a desk and be at that sort of lower energy level? I've helped teachers make some adaptations in classrooms that have to do with, who they're sitting by, or, where they're doing their work. Can they stand up to do their work? Can they lay on the ground? Are there other ways that kids can kind of use their energy to be able to focus? And with our relationships with kids, can we start talking with them about how they feel in their body? Because this is really the beginning of building up some affect identification. It looks like your body is getting out of control, or it looks like you're having a lot of fidgety, nervous energy today. That's one of the first things we do in co-regulation with babies. And again, that's something we really need to think about doing with older kids too, because if they, haven't had these things identified for them before, they may not even be aware that that's how their body is acting right now. So we ask teachers to notice things like, when does your student look anxious? Is there an increase or change in behavior? Draw upon your relationship with a student and provide some of that co-regulation. he noticed a kid yesterday while the other kids were working, and they talked with the teacher about, one of the kids who was really the only one in the class not doing anything, and what was going on with him. And so we did some co-regulation with him. Some empathic, non-judgmental approaches around just kind of understanding where kids are coming from and having a calm voice and body. So this is different for different teachers. Some teachers just have a louder voice or have, a different kind of body language. And so this is important for, school staff, psychologists, social workers, administrators to really work all together to understand what do calm voices and bodies mean in our school. Asking some simple questions like, are you okay? What can I do to help you? Kids don't always know how to answer those, so that becomes an opportunity for a conversation of, do you know what you need to be doing right now? Or is there a way that I can help you do that? If a student asks a question, we should assume that they don't know and provide a calm, clear response. And that might seem obvious, but I think one of the things we're really trying to help folks understand, especially with kids who have been impacted by complex trauma, is that they don't have the skills that we just sometimes assume that they have. Kids do well if they can. That's from, the collaborative problem solving model with Ross Green, where he talks about, there's a lot of missing skills, and we should not assume that kids know things, even though sometimes we think they should. I also would encourage, brain breaks, peace corners, things like that to build into the classroom to create more safety and more points of connection for those positive relationship interactions. When it comes to behavior, we like to consider modifications to classroom behavior support plans that will allow students to do what they need to do to self-regulate. So obviously there are still boundaries and procedures, but for these kids that I was talking about who really need to probably run for 20 minutes a couple of times a day, is there may be a way that we could get them some more physical activity throughout the day, things like that within the procedures. It could also look like just taking a break, moving to a different part of the room, but really being flexible around how to get kids who've been exposed to complex trauma both the empathy and the structure to function well and heal from trauma. This is something that comes up over and over again, where when teachers or staff do start to understand really what a kid's been through, sometimes they respond by feeling really bad for that kid, and kind of not even just compassion, but pity. And then that leads them down a road of just not wanting to kind of impose structure or expectations in the way that they do for others. Versus some teachers learn about that and they, stick with the stance of, it doesn't matter. Every kid in my classroom has the same expectations no matter what. And what we really want to see happen, especially for kids with complex trauma, is a balance of empathy and structure. We still need to hold kids to really high expectations, but we also need to provide them with the empathy and understanding that they need to heal. So a few things about consequences, because teachers will always ask, well, then what do you do, right? If we're trying to kind of really understand the behavior and not just blame kids for what they're doing, how do we help them learn? And, a lot of teachers really want consequences, right, for misbehavior, what they consider to be misbehavior. And we, I think I operate from the framework that consequences are useful when they teach lessons about right and wrong, when they give students incentive to do well. But kids with challenging behavior usually already know that what they've done is, quote unquote wrong. But there's this idea that there are these kids that just won't do what's right versus kids that can't do it. And really, we do believe that kids do well if they can. And again, that's from that Ross Green model. So sometimes consequences that are experienced as punitive can actually escalate a child even more and even more into challenging or dangerous behaviors. So if there are consequences and things that are in place within a school, we really want teachers and staff to think about how to do that still within the framework of a positive relationship. And then I'll just talk quickly about some competency pieces, and then we can have some time for questions. So when we talk about building competencies, this idea of competency or mastery is so important, especially for kids, in this latency age, elementary, middle, and even into high school too. But the belief in your abilities to do well is one of these foundational blocks of building resilience. And it usually happens within the context of a relationship. And so it happens within the context of a teacher who really believes in your writing and pushes you, or a basketball coach who, praises your play and gives you tips and helps you believe in yourself and your abilities in that area. So it doesn't have to be, something academic, but if kids can answer this question, what are you good at? It really bodes well for them down the road, because they have something really concrete to hold on to and to work towards in a way that might very well help pull them forward from their adversity into resilience. I just like to show this slide because these are, I don't know if you recognize any of these faces, probably some of them. These are some really important figures and leaders in our world who experienced trauma as children. And so I'll tell you from the top, left to right, is Barack Obama, Gloria Steinem, Sonia Sotomayor, Tina Turner, and bottom left to right is Maya Angelou, John Lennon, Oprah, and Trevor Noah. So this is all, all of this talk about trauma and what we can do about it is all in the effort to really promote resilience and really remind ourselves that kids are so amazing and can heal from so much when they're given these opportunities. Something that all of these people have in common is they had a relationship in their life that really made a difference. At least one. They had at least one caregiver that really had their back, that was behind them, whether that was a family member or a school leader. They all, have these identified, positive relationships with an adult that made the difference for them down the road. So here are some resources that I would suggest, looking into if you're interested in learning more. The HEARTS program, the UCSF website kind of talks about the HEARTS model, how that was developed. In CTSN, helping traumatized children learn, ACE is too high, mindful schools. These are all some of, I think, the great resources we have available. There are so many more too. So now I will try and figure out, how we kind of take this to questions too.
Yes, we do have some questions, which is wonderful.
Great.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I know I got a lot from it. One question we have is, as psychologists, we have a lot to deal with in terms of confidentiality. So how much information can we be sharing with teachers and administrators regarding complex trauma cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I have, let me put this back up so everyone can see it. I have worked in schools primarily as someone who, I didn't mean to do that, sorry, who came from the outside in. And so, let's do this real quick. Okay, so I've been primarily working on from the outside in. So I worked for universities or community mental health centers or other nonprofits where we are bound by HIPAA, and so we have really difficult conversations with schools and staff a lot about what we can and cannot share. And there's some differing opinions out there, I think, about how much is really helpful to know versus how much is too much and things like that. So I'd say, my perspective's coming from a little bit different than being maybe the school psychologist, but there have been times where I have talked with a family about, I think it would actually be really helpful if your child's teacher understood, a little bit about your family history, not everything, and we can talk about what specific things, you would be comfortable sharing, but I think it would really help them understand some of the times, that your child is struggling in the classroom, and it would help them see the behavior differently and potentially then help them, respond to your child in a more supportive way. And so sometimes, I've really advocated with families to do that, but probably more often than not, what I have, pushed for is, just protecting privacy and confidentiality and helping teachers and staff understand that you don't need to know, all of the specifics. You may know certain pieces here and there based on what a child's told you or what other people have told you, but you can still employ trauma-sensitive practices that will really help this child, and you have to kind of try them out and see what happens, because they don't always work, for everyone. We have some kids who, based on abuse histories or things like that, that don't respond well to praise. So that whole slide that I presented about, praise and positive affirmation, you might have to really tweak that if you have a kid who's really just not responding to that in the way that you would want. But I do think protecting, privacy and confidentiality is the utmost importance. And I think there are times where, we can talk with families about why it might be helpful for a school or a certain teacher to know some of the things that have happened, just to better understand and better support the student.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question that came up to kind of follow up on that one was, would you change anything if you were to have this conversation with special educators and paraprofessionals?
Yes, some of the training that I've done has been, specifically geared towards paraprofessionals and special educators. And so I think that some of what we've worked on with paras that's a little bit different is they're often in the position of being really one-on-one with kids for a large chunk of time. Not always, but a lot of the paras that I've worked with, will spend the morning with one kid and the afternoon with another kid or something like that. So they're really in an amazing opportunity to build relationships that are really positive and really different with these kids than maybe what they've experienced before. So we really want to, I don't know that I would change necessarily much of the content, but maybe even dive a little bit deeper into some of the things around, like, what your own triggers are and how to really self-regulate yourself when you're working with a kid who gets triggered multiple times throughout the day, how to really advocate for kids that you're working with, and ways to help them, that will sort of help them be able to bridge the supportive, positive relationship they might be building with you into other relationships. And then in the AN classroom, at least the classrooms that I have been part of, I would say that nearly all or all of those kids, and again, this is just my experience in the particular classrooms I've been in, have a trauma history. And that's really different than a classroom where, some of the kids have had experienced trauma, but not everyone. Some of the things that you might want to do, with a classroom where you are pretty sure everyone has had some traumatic experiences, might be different. And I think, again, some of those same recommendations, but diving a little bit deeper. And so when you think about mirroring, validating, empathizing as something you might do in a regular classroom when someone's triggered, in an AN classroom, what I might think about is, how do you do that? How do you just build that in so that every day kids are getting that experience of feeling attuned to someone, and they don't even have to be having a problem or an issue or anything, but just getting them to be able to experience that on a regular basis. And so it might look a little bit like that, of just, how to build that, some of those more like what might be targeted toward a specific kid in a regular classroom. How would we build that into the whole classroom for the AN classroom?
Wonderful. So we have quite a few questions coming in, which is great. Another one is, other than the ACEs questionnaire, have you come across any other screening tools that measure ACEs? And then I'll ask you a follow-up question after that.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm working with a group of school-based health centers right now who are all using the ACE. They're using the ACEs questionnaire, but they're also using the questionnaire that was developed at the Center for Youth Wellness. So the Center for Youth Wellness is a pediatric center out of San Francisco that's completely focused on, ACEs and trauma, and a public health approach really to care for children. And so they use the ACEs screener, but they also created an additional 10 items screener. And so in addition to the 10 original ACEs, there are 10 other items, and I'm not going to be able to remember them right now off the top of my head, but they're available on their website. So again, it's the Center for Youth Wellness. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is the director of that center. And so they talk on their website about how they developed these other 10 questions, and then they use that when they do screening for everyone who comes to their clinic. Hang on just a second. Sorry, I just need to take a quick drink. So the other screeners that I've used for trauma are primarily clinical tools. So there's the UCLA PTSD screener, for example, but these are tools really meant more to diagnose rather than just screen for trauma. Although they do both, right? Because you have to identify what are the traumas that a child has experienced before you kind of go into the symptoms. There's the trauma symptom youth checklist as well for a more clinical tool that was developed by John Briere out of California, and that's a nice measure if you're wanting to look at some of the more of the symptomology. But as far as just screening for ACEs, the ACEs measure itself and those additional 10 items that a lot of clinics are using now are the primary ones that I know of.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question was, what are your thoughts on adopting a growth mindset in the classroom for developing resilience in students?
Yeah, I'm starting to learn a lot more about the growth mindset right now. So from what I've been exposed to so far, what I've read so far and seen happen in the classrooms, I find it really complementary because I think it does really promote that balance of what I was talking about earlier, the empathy and the structure, right? Of really having some brain-based understanding of what might be happening and still having this these high expectations. We've been working with someone recently who does a lot of work in classrooms around the productive struggle and just how to get kids really engaged in the fact that like it's okay not to know the answer, and it's not just that it's okay, but like one of the best parts about learning is failing, and to give them just enough information at a time that they continue to struggle and continue to move forward, but that it stays within that frame of them feeling supported enough to keep pushing and challenged enough to really be building some new skills. So I find it very complimentary, and I'm glad that a lot of schools are moving in that direction.
Certainly, thank you. Another question is, what are some ways you have convinced administrators not to suspend a child for verbal threats when agitated, or even for those who exhibited some aggression?
Yeah, great question. The model that we use, the Hearts model, is a long-term model, so we don't see these changes happen quickly. I'll just start by saying that when we talk about 3 to 5 year sort of shifts that we see in schools. So my job is really to help people's mindset shift and then give them the skills to do things differently. So just like I'm hoping, I try to help teachers see behavior differently. Also want to really help administrators see that differently and empower them to come up with, or support them in coming up with some alternatives. We work really closely with restorative practice partners, so a restorative justice model that's trauma informed can go a long way in helping administrators buy into this idea that, suspension actually isn't what's necessarily going to, going back to those, what do we want to come out of consequences? Kids don't learn to do things differently when they're suspended. They're not gaining new skills. They're not developing a sense of understanding of what's right and wrong. And restorative practices, restorative justice really offers that model especially when done in a trauma-informed way. And I just keep throwing that caveat there because I've seen it done in both ways. And yeah, so we really focus on, how do we shift the mindset to the point where teachers and administrators are now asking those questions. Well, what could we do differently? What could we do instead of suspending a kid who's been aggressive or, has crossed some of those lines? So I would say, that's sort of when it happens the best. And then, sometimes we'll do training just, really in particular on, how is the school going to address aggressive behavior, and work with the admin team to come up with a plan that they want to try out, that they can get teachers on board with. And often, in my experience, I will say sometimes the administrators are not the ones pushing back against not suspending. It's sometimes the teachers. The teachers are feeling like nothing happens. The kid goes down to the office, there's a restorative conversation, they come back to class with a sucker, and the teachers are pissed because they feel like, this kid should have had a consequence and been in trouble. And they're not really seeing or understanding the restorative piece that's happening. So it really does have to be a school-wide kind of partnership to get everybody on the same page.
Wonderful. Thank you. So another question that we have is, sorry, just one second. Little technical difficulty here. So can you comment on the role of teachers in supporting students with complex trauma who are also marginalized due to racism, xenophobia, transphobia, and heterosexism?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is central to a lot of our work, and I didn't really go into it much today, just decisions about time, but I see all of those isms and phobias as really a big part of the complex trauma picture. Again, complex trauma we think of as happening in those attachment relationships, but it also happens in our relationships with our schools and communities that are supposed to protect children and instead often expose them to these prejudices and isms. And we know that kids who experience, for example, racism on a regular basis, whether it's at the microaggression level or the overt racism experience, are further impacted, in a trauma, in a traumatic way by those experiences. So, the community I work in is a community that is predominantly white teachers and predominantly students of color. So we have these conversations, particularly around race and ethnicity all the time, about how implicit bias and teacher lens from their background, plays into their decisions about student consequences and behaviors. Teachers will, I've worked with teachers who will say things to students like, say to a student who is experiencing, let's say a lot of poverty and some difficulties at home, a student of color who's experiencing racism, things like, I bet you can't wait for the holidays to have 2 weeks off of school. And, that's based on their experience, right? When they were growing up, they really looked forward to the holiday breaks and a couple of weeks at home. But for this student in particular that they said this to, it's not that way, right? They feel they're really targeted in their community. They feel unsafe at home when nobody's at home with them during the day. They don't know when they're going to eat, what they're going to eat, and they certainly don't know, have the same kind of expectations around the holiday break. And so it's a lot of work with teachers around really understanding where they're coming from, where their students come from, and being open to talking about those things. Really setting up a safe relationship with us so that they can have those conversations about, what, the 3 kids that are the most disciplined in my class are the 3 African American boys. And so what do I need to look at in order to think about that, make some changes there? And that's where the work really gets going and really gets good, when teachers are willing and open to having those conversations. And it's absolutely essential that we get them there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So maybe, one last question.
Sure.
So what do you do when a student is being unsafe in the classroom and you feel threatened or triggered?
Yeah. This comes up a lot, and a lot of my work has been in elementary schools, and it still comes up a lot. I think so we do want, everyone to feel safe, of course, and we want to identify what are those things that are making the adults in the room feel unsafe. So in the moment, if someone's feeling unsafe, I think, we just get more support, right? Get someone else in the room, get another body. And what we talk about with teachers a lot, or other staff, is just, if nothing else, stay in control of yourself, right? Control your own breathing, control your own reaction. If there's nothing else that you can control in that moment, and get some help. Long term, down the road, as far as a consultant, or some things that I would want to do with that teacher would be, to really explore the relationship, with that student or students that that they do feel unsafe around and where that comes from. We had some research done in Denver public schools, not we personally, but as a state, there was some research done in our Denver public schools that was published widely around how teachers feel more unsafe with students of color. And so I think a lot of times those conversations need to go into that conversation about why do you feel unsafe with this kid, and the way that we've been socialized, to perceive certain kinds of people as dangerous. We worked with a kindergartner this year who could really bring the school to a screeching halt. He could throw desks and chairs and hit other students, and his behavior was really, really concerning to a lot of people. And he was a young boy of color who was getting into all of this trouble, and so that can never not be part of that conversation either. And then we work really hard with the schools, teachers, and the administrators, and whoever the other supports are, whether it's the school psychologists or other team members, to come up with some safety planning. So whether that's there's one kid that I've been working with this year where we've set up just some check-ins for him throughout the day with the person that he is the most connected to at the school, and that has really gone a long way with his behavior in his regular classroom, of being less aggressive and having a more regulated behavior. So there's a lot of different ways to approach that, but ultimately it comes back to looking at the relationship.
Wonderful, thank you. So we'll end there with the questions. Thank you so much again for being here today and sharing your expertise with everyone. I know I certainly got a lot from it, and it was clear that everybody else who attended did too, as there are a lot of really great questions and comments with respect to the information that you presented in response to the questions. Thank you everyone else as well, and as I mentioned, for all of the great questions. We really appreciated that. We hope you learned a lot from this webinar, and will use this information as you support youth in schools in other settings. And just as a reminder, the recorded webinar will be distributed by Division 16, and those of you who signed up for CEs will also be contacted by the division. Thank you, everyone.